You're listening to The Voice of Russia. I'm Rob Sachs. Each year, the U.S. State Department releases its annual report on international religious freedom. This year's report encompasses 198 countries and territories and details areas in the world where citizens still struggle to practice their religion without state intervention. We wanted to talk about the findings of the report and focus on some of the criticisms of Russia. To that end, we've invited to the program Professor Thomas Farr. He's the director of the Religious Freedom Project at the Berkley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs, and he's also a visiting associate professor of religion and international affairs at Georgetown University. Also on the line with us is Alexander Dvorkin. He's a professor of church history and Celtic studies at St. Tikhon's Orthodox University in Moscow. He's also the director of the Council of Experts for Conducting State Religious Studies within Russia's Ministry of Justice. Welcome to you both.
Thanks for having me.
So, Thomas Farr, let's start with you. What are some of the highlights of this report?
Well, this report is a sort of transition report. The State Department has been doing this now for 11 years, and they're changing the dates that it's being covered. So this is only a 6-month report. It is the first one issued under the new Ambassador at Large for Religious Freedom. And I think there are no major surprises in the report. It identifies, or they have identified along with it, I think it's 8 of the so-called countries of particular concern, which are the major persecuting countries around the world. Those, I believe I'm correct, have not changed from the last time these were identified. I might note that while the report indicates that religious freedom has deteriorated in Russia, Russia is not on the list of serious violators, and so I think those are the major points.
Alexander Dvorkin, what's your reaction to this report?
Well, of course, I've read only the Russia's part. I should say, for one thing, it's very sloppily done, because, I suppose people who've done it have done a very bad job, even in terms of terminology, because, the terminology is crisscrossed and they use very different terms for kind of the same phenomena and for the same geographical names or for the same officials. Then, of course, many of the so-called violations which are listed there are repeated several times in different parts of this report. I suppose it's just to show the mass quality of violations. So the same thing is repeated over and over. And of course, I have a lot of complaints about what is said there. Otherwise, there is a lot of impartiality in it and a lot of bias, because basically there are 2 or 3 reporters whose reports are used and whose findings are used to compile this report. For example, so-called Slavic Center of Law and Justice, and it seems for those people who are not familiar with this group, with this organization, that it's something coming from Russia. But in fact, Slavic Center of Law and Justice is just dependency or branch of American Center of Law and Justice, which is founded and funded by Pat Robertson, which of course is a very biased person and it has a biased opinion. Also, it quotes Portal Creda RU, which belongs to a small, schismatic group, which is very, very much anti-Orthodox Church. So basically, those 2 sources are used throughout the report to prove that there is a persecution of various religious groups in Russia. So, and I have some questions to Professor Farr, but I suppose that a bit later. But that's my opinion about the report.
I want to ask you, Professor Farr, about that, the methodology of the report and those who are doing the reporting. What was the criteria for those who were criticizing the different countries and for looking at it, and are there perhaps some flaws in the methodology?
Well, of course, before I answer that, let me situate myself a little bit as to where I stand on this report. I was part of the State Department when the law was passed back in the late 90s and was involved in structuring the report, which has changed a bit over time. And so my own position is that I am a supporter of the policy, but a rather consistent critic of the State Department and the way that it has carried out the policy. Now, to answer your question, the way the reports are done is not to rely on outside groups, whether of Pat Robertson or anyone else, but to use the American embassy and its contacts, both within a given government, in this case the Russian government,
but
and
Mr. Farr, that's throughout this report, exactly Slavic Center of Law and Justice is quoted as reliable source.
Well,
and that's
I would say, Mr. Dvorkin, that the fact that a group happens to be a branch from an American group is not in and of itself disqualifying. In fact, the report comes from America. So the question isn't who is behind it, but whether the facts are correct. I think you would agree with that, and perhaps we should talk about that. Of course, mistakes can be made. They have been made, will be made. I would urge you to contact directly the Office of Religious Freedom with those factual criticisms, and I can assure you they'll take them into account, and I can put you in touch with them.
Well, let's get into some of the factual criticisms. The report says that their restrictions on religious freedoms in Russia fell into 4 categories. 1 was registration of religious organizations, 2, access to places of worship, 3, visas for foreign religious personnel, and 4, government raids on religious organizations and detentions of individuals. Alexander Dvorkin, do you dispute that these are some of the things that happen in Russia?
Well, some things did happen, but of course, whatever says there is grossly exaggerated, and a lot of things really, are not reliable. Of course, we don't have the time to discuss every case, so I have to propose a little bit different approach, because it seems that the U.S. is obviously having difficulty in getting Russia to accept its view on social religious issues. And the simple reason for this is because the U.S. lacks credibility in this. The U.S. yearly reports on religious freedom on every country on earth except the U.S. itself. Of course, they must cost millions for the U.S. taxpayers, and the question is, why it's done and why, the millions are spent. And then the test case for to help evaluate the U.S. sincerity or hypocrisy is the case of Scientology. In Russia, we want our citizens, our churches, our schools, our governments, our judges, our juries, our witnesses, our accused, our families, everyone to be able to speak freely about Scientology. And why on earth the United States does not want the freedom for all those people or institutions in the U.S. itself? Why does American government not conduct hearings about the nature and effect of what is exporting, that is Scientology? Why has Scientology in the U.S. became undiscussable in legal proceedings? Why are people intimidated into silence about Scientology? And then I have 2 short test cases for this freedom of people everywhere is Scientology versus Jerry Armstrong case. And I'll tell to our listeners, Jerry Armstrong is a Canadian who was a member of Scientology for 12 years. Then he left Scientology, and as a result of a court case in California, he was prohibited to speak about Scientology, even to pronounce the names, like Scientology, L.Ron Hubbard, Dianetics, etc. And if he just says it, he has to pay $10,000 for each utterance. And the same, and it's actually in a court decision, it's applied to all people who are acting in consort with him. That's like Mr. Armstrong had been a guest in Russia several months ago. He was invited by the Ministry of Justice. He was invited by the Russian Orthodox Church. He was invited by several universities to speak. And I suppose do all these institutions, obviously, then they act in consort with him. Do all they have to pay $10,000 each? And the second short case was accepted in the just less than 2 years ago in August 1910. California court about Claire Headley, who was a member of Scientology.
Rob, do you note that
Professor,
we're no longer talking about Russia?
Alexander Dvorkin, you were bringing up a lot of things about Scientology that you felt were hypocritical for the United States to be bringing up, and also you questioned why the United States was issuing all these reports on all these 198 different countries and territories, but failed to look at
the United States itself.
Except, right. So I wanted to pose those two questions to Thomas Farr to have him address those.
Sure, those are great questions. First, let me point out that Mr. Dvorkin declined to answer your question about Russia. I'm happy to defend the U.S. the U.S. policy on religious freedom. First, let me say the United States is not perfect. Scientology
so where is the report about the state of religious freedom in the United States?
Mr. Dvorkin,
where is this report?
I believe Thomas Farr is about to answer that. Let me
answer that. I mean, we're not perfect. I think we've got a pretty good record on religious freedom. Scientology has a great deal of freedom here. It also has an enormous amount of criticism. And if Mr. Dvorkin isn't aware of that, he just needs to Google Scientology in the United States. There are people who are great critics. They are heard. They're not intimidated. And the very fact that
Mr. Armstrong is intimidated.
Mr. Armstrong has been to Russia, has spoken freely about his experiences. That is religious freedom.
But he cannot enter the United States.
Let me finish, please, sir. This is religious freedom at work when people can speak freely about their own religious views and criticize the religious views of others. That is what you cannot do in Russia. Why does the United States
Mr. Armstrong cannot do it?
Why does the United States issue such a report? It does it for two reasons. First is a humanitarian reason. People are suffering around the world. There are tens of millions of people who are being violently persecuted because of their religious beliefs, and we want to stand with those people. The second, and they're Muslims, they're Christians, they're Hindus, they're Buddhists, it really doesn't matter. The second reason, though, and I think this really gets to your concerns, and I would love to hear you address it, this is a security problem. Religious freedom has been linked with a positive security, with political, economic, and social goods. Russia is a country that is struggling to root its democracy. There's plenty of evidence in history and in modern scholarship to suggest that if you don't have religious freedom in full for everybody, for every Russian citizen, then you're not going to get democracy right. It just won't work. So this is not the United States wagging its finger at Russia. This is the United States saying, hey, why don't you consider the need for this?
Alexander Dvorkin, would you like to respond?
Well, I didn't hear the answer why there is no report on the state of religious freedom in the United States.
I'm happy to answer that, too.
Okay.
You don't want your own State Department writing a report on the internal affairs of the United States. But this is a very open country. As I said, we've got many problems. We've got some challenges to religious freedom. The United Nations has written, the Special Rapporteur has written a report on the United States. Russia is free to criticize the United States, as Mr. Dvorkin is doing, anytime it wants. So, the answer is I don't want the State Department, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, writing a report on its own country, but I invite anyone else to do it freely because we're an open society. Take a shot.
Well, so there is a case of Armstrong who is not able to enter the United States, and according to the U.S. court, cannot say a word Scientology publicly. There is a case of Claire Hadley, who just lost
a
court case against Scientology in California, and the court said that Scientology has the right to lock people up. Scientology has the right to chase them and to return them if they escape. Scientology has the right to deprive them of food and of sleep. Scientology has the right to force them to do the abortion.
I don't know the case, but I suspect it is absolutely incorrect. And if Mr. Armstrong is saying
this case is in front of me, it's United States District Court.
I think we're getting
the case. I think it's not true.
Gemma, I think we're getting bogged down in this particular case, It looks like we're not going to have a set of agreed-upon facts for this particular instance. But, gentlemen, we're going to take a quick break in the discussion. You're listening to The Voice of Russia. I'm Rob Sachs, along with Jessica Jordan, and we're speaking about the State Department Annual Report on International Religious Freedom with Alexander Dvorkin of St. Tikhon's Orthodox University in Moscow. Also on the line is Professor Thomas Farr. He's the director of the Religious Freedom Project at the Berkley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs.
This is the Voice of Russia.
Welcome back to the discussion. We're speaking about the International Religious Freedom Report by the U.S. State Department. We're speaking with Professor Thomas Farr of the Berkley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs. Also on the line is Alexander Dvorkin, Professor of Church History and Celtic Studies at St. Tikhon's Orthodox University in Moscow. I wanted to ask you, Alexander Dvorkin, in Russia, does Scientology receive all the same rights as the Russian Orthodox Church?
Of course not, because we do not recognize Scientology as a religion. Just as Germany, democratic Germany, doesn't recognize Scientology as a religion, just as France, democratic France, in fact, democracy, was in France before there was United States democracy. So France is the oldest democratic state in Europe, and France doesn't recognize Scientology as a religion, and I hope Russia would never recognize Scientology as a religion.
Do you recognize the right of people to join whatever religious group they wish for religious reasons, so long as they do not harm the fundamental rights of others?
Yeah, yes, absolutely. But religious freedom is an individual freedom. Is a freedom of individual to choose whatever religion he wants to choose, he or she, or to live whatever religion he or she wants to live, or not to join any religion at all.
But we're in complete agreement about that.
Let's let Mr. Dvorkin finish his point here.
Yeah, but religious freedom is not a right of religious corporations to persecute its members.
Of course not.
To deprive them of human rights. And and that's what we see in the United States, because United States courts have always or almost always supported the rights of religious corporations against the rights of its own members. And that's not religious freedom.
Mr. Dvorkin, then what then is the criteria used to distinguish in Russia which is a legitimate religious organization and which one isn't a legitimate organization?
Well, we have a Ministry of Justice who registers religious organizations, but no matter whether this or that religious organization is registered or not, some religious organizations in Russia, so-called religious groups, they prefer not to be registered.
What about Jehovah's Witnesses, Mr. Dvorkin?
What about Jehovah's Witnesses?
Do they have complete freedom, the same freedom that members of the Russian Orthodox Church do?
Those members, those organizations that are registered, yes, they have the same freedom. But also there is one in this report. Actually, it's good that you reminded me. There is one basic flaw, because one thing is freedom of religion, and one thing is not violation of religious rights, and another thing is granting privileges. Suppose I am a director of a firm and I have several employees, and I pay each employee whatever salary we agreed upon. Then I decide that I like one employee and I want to pay him more. I want to raise him. So if I do it, does it mean that I persecute the others? Doesn't mean that I violate the rights of the others? Not at all.
It does if you believe that equality under the law is the operable principle here.
No.
And so the answer is Jehovah's Witnesses and Mormons, for example.
We in European countries have traditional religious organizations, which in every European country, or almost every European country, some religious organizations are recognized as traditional because they played a very important role in history and in culture of any given country. United States has a different history, and so it's incomparable. We cannot force United States standards on European countries. So Russian Orthodox Church played an enormous role in Russian history. So if the state grants some privileges to the Orthodox Church, then it's the right of the state. It doesn't mean that other groups are persecuted. The other group have their basic rights, and they are not violated.
It does not mean, you're correct, necessarily that they're persecuted, and I think you're right insofar as you mean, if what you mean is that traditional religions in a state can have certain kinds of acknowledgement in the fundamental documents and so forth, and perhaps even some privilege with respect to tax preferences. But I would suggest to you that it becomes very, very difficult to protect the religious freedom of other groups when you favor one. And I think that's what we're seeing in Russia. I think the Russian Orthodox Church clearly is the traditional church of Russia, but it is having an impact on non-Orthodox individuals, and I think it's hurting Russia. I mean, I
don't know this fact that Russian Orthodox Church has an impact on non-Orthodox individuals. Perhaps only in the case when non-Orthodox individuals want to convert to Russian Orthodox Church, then it has an impact. If they freely choose the Russian Orthodox Church, but then it has an impact. But otherwise, no, it doesn't. It's not a state church of Russia. Oh no, and so it has no impact.
Well, it does if others are not given the same fundamental rights of freedom of religion, both in terms of their private activities, but also in terms of their public activities, their involvement in political life. But what about Mr. Nursi, Saeed Nursi, and his Sunni Muslim group, which, according to this
report,
has
Russian Orthodox Church has to do with Saeed Nursi?
Well, a great deal. If you're privileging one group, and the result is that Muslims in your country are not having equal treatment because of the privileging of that group, that would be the answer to your question.
No, it has nothing to do with the Orthodox Church. The state has recognized the writings of Nursi as extremist and calling to religious discord, and this concerns only 0.1% of all Muslims. So
I would suggest
I just want to, Jim, if I could just jump in.
Minority is very, very important to the health of any democracy.
Gentlemen, if I could just jump in and bring up this point that Professor Dvorkin was bringing up, Thomas Farr. If Russia, it does have a legitimate problem with terrorism. Some of these groups have religious affiliations. What's the line between detaining a potentially dangerous individual and restricting a group's religious freedoms?
Speech is very important in any democracy, including religious speech. To the extent we see this now in the Islamic Organization of the Islamic Conference, I think they've just changed their name, to outlaw defamation of religion. This is a terrible idea. The way you deal with defamation of religion is by defending it with words, not by getting the state involved and throwing them into jail. My point here is not so much a normative point. I think Mr. Dvorkin and I probably agree on a lot more than it sounds like. What we're really talking about, what is the state involvement, the proper state involvement in a democracy in which the fundamental principle is equality under the law. And I'm just making the argument that all of these groups, Pentecostals, Muslims, Mormons, even Scientologists, the best way to deal with them is by a free market of ideas, not through these restrictive categories of registration, labeling these groups. And, of course, again, let me emphasize, I'm not speaking of acts of violence. I'm speaking of words and ideas and how you deal with them.
Well, Alexander Dvorkin, why label Scientologists and Jehovah's Witnesses as a extremist cult? What good does that do the state? Why not, as Thomas Farr was saying, have more ideas out there in the marketplace and instead of restricting them?
So therefore, for more ideas and somehow, but the U.S. and Mr. Farr consider the criticism of Scientology in Russia as being Scientology or Jehovah's Witnesses as being the acts of violence. Mr. Farr mentioned people thrown in jail. I would like to know, how many religious leaders and groups have been thrown in jail in Russia.
Well,
and compare it, for example, with a great friend of the United States, Saudi Arabia, which is not on the list, or somewhere in a very honorable place on the list, where people are publicly executed and where the...
I think you're incorrect, sir. I believe they are on the countries of particular concern list. They have been for many years, and they are now. There is no religious freedom in Saudi Arabia. On that, we agree.
And people are executed and people are prohibited from converting to Christianity?
It's absolutely a scandal, and the report says that.
Well, so what about the relationship of the U.S. with Saudi Arabia?
So
with its strategic partner?
I think we're getting off base with Saudi Arabia because I think, as Mr. Farr is pointing out, the United States is highly critical of Saudi Arabia. In fact, more critical than it is of Russia because Russia is not listed among the 8 countries of particular concern, though there are things that are concerning to the United States in this report. But I want to get back to this point. You mentioned not throwing people, Scientologists in jail. However, we did say that there are other restrictions, perhaps not jail time, but access to places of worship, registration of religious organizations, visas for foreign religious personnel, and government raids on religious organizations that have come up.
But we have a lot of people who were abused by Scientology. We have a constant stream of phone calls, people who were deprived by Scientology of their livelihood, people who were whose health was ruined by Scientology, whose families were ruined by Scientology. We have a list of calls for the same for Jehovah's Witnesses and for other groups. So how do we have to react? European countries do react. If
you're
France,
telling me that Jehovah's Witnesses are violent, I mean, I think that's
Jehovah's Witnesses refused to transfuse blood to him.
Okay, well let's get to some of those points then and have Thomas Farr. Why don't you address them? So if Russia's seeing that there's things that are hurting individuals and that members of religious organizations are hurting individuals, whether it's a Jehovah's Witness practice,
not members of religious organizations itself,
right? That are hurting
individuals.
What is then the proper role of the state to react? For instance, if Jehovah's Witness is denied a blood transfusion, which in the United States is legal, but Russia says, our morals are different. We feel like that would be an illegal act. Is that not just a difference in?
We're talking about children. Children.
Is that not just a difference in culture?
No, I think the United States would. If that's what the issue is, and I question, frankly, whether that is all there is to it, but parents are responsible for children. And if somebody lures children away from their parents and prevents them from getting a blood transfusion, that's what we're talking about, the United States would stand with any country in saying it's the parents that have to be responsible for their children. But that's not typically the problem that you have with Jehovah's Witnesses. The problem with Jehovah's Witnesses is they show up at your door and they want to talk to you. And these people are among the most... I don't particularly like the theology. I'm a Catholic. But I'll tell you, they don't use force against people, trick people. If there are those cases, prosecute them, but don't write off that religious group because of 1 or 2 incidents. That's my response.
All right.
When Jehovah's Witnesses had showed at my door, they started out with saying that Orthodox Church is the Babylon whore. If that's not religious insult, and if that's not incitement of religious, if that's not an incitement of religious discord, I don't know what is.
It is the incitement of religious discord, but it ought not to be illegal. The role of the state in this ought to be to create a free market of religious ideas so members of the Orthodox Church can respond in kind, and that is with words and ideas, not by throwing those people in jail.
We just have 1 minute left, and I don't know I just want to get each of your sense of the value in the State Department report on religious freedom. Alexander Dvorkin, we'll start with you. Do you see any value in a type of report like this, critiquing other countries and looking at their religious practices?
Well, I can talk only about Russia, but if the U.S. wants to acquire the credibility, it doesn't have to preach religious freedom to others. It must practice what it preaches. the United States must examine Scientology and other groups and investigate and deal with Scientology versus Armstrong case and others, and to make it free for everyone to speak about Scientology system and Scientology entity. I think that's my answer.
Thomas Farr, just have about a minute left. What's your final take?
Here's the value of this report. It is not to impose an American system on anyone else, but to get people like Mr. Dvorkin and others to consider that it may be, perhaps not, but it may be in their own interests to widen their own system of religious freedom, not because the United States says to do it or the United Nations or anyone else, but religious freedom is highly associated with the consolidation and rooting of democracy, with economic growth, with social stability, with security, with the countering of religion-based terrorism, which I know is a problem in Russia as it has been in the United States. So this isn't special pleading for the First Amendment. This is special pleading for human beings and for security and stability that we all seek, and I'm sure Mr. Dvorkin and I agree on that.
Well, we're going to have to leave it there. Unfortunately, we're out of time. That was Professor Thomas Farr. He's the director of the Religious Freedom Project at the Berkley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs. He's also a visiting associate professor of religion and international affairs at Georgetown University. We're also joined by Alexander Dvorkin. He's a professor of church history and Celtic studies at St. Tikhon's Orthodox University in Moscow. He's also the director of the Council of Experts for conducting state religious studies within Russia's Ministry of Justice. Thank you both so much for joining us. Really appreciate it.
It's been a pleasure.
Bye.
The same here.